And what I find compelling about Jesus is that I can see the attentiveness that I want in my life modeled in the way that he interacts with the people around him. This is God with soft skills. Last week was the art of intention. Today we look at the art of attention. And we will explore Tuesday dinner, heuristic models, missing verses, and finally some honest attention. But as I thought about attention this week, the main image that came to mind for me was dinner. A dinner on Tuesday night in particular. See, I do most of the cooking in our house. My wife Rachel does the baking. I find that all far too restricting. All those measurements and directions and recipes. Just let me put in as much butter and salt as I want, all right? And one of the traditional problems with doing the cooking in the house is figuring out what you're going to make for dinner, and then what you're going to make for dinner for the kids, right? So my kids rarely appreciate my cooking. They would much rather exist on a diet of Mr. Noodle and Kraft Dinner. By the way, my kids used to have much more adventurous palates. I remember when my son was 4 or 5, Rachel and I would scoff at those parents who complained about their picky eaters, thinking we had simply raised a child of extraordinary culinary enculturation only for him to revert to noodles and ketchup about a year later. However, I did come across a theory that made me feel a little better about my cooking. I read a paper that suggested that evolutionarily, children start off with an openness to all kinds of flavors. That's because they need to eat whatever they're given. They can't hunt and forage for themselves, so whatever mom and dad provide has to be acceptable to their palates. But then somewhere around the age of 4 or 5, the age that kids start moving more freely on their own and their range expands beyond the view of their parents, their palates actually become much more sensitive to strong flavors like bitterness. That's because that's the age we want our kids to stop putting poisonous berries and moldy leftovers into their mouths. So those picky palates are designed to protect them from otherwise bad choices. Now, is it true? I don't know, but it is what I tell myself when my kids refuse my best efforts. There's at least some peer review to back up the quality of my cooking. Anyway, on Tuesday night, we're sitting around the table, and I had made this sort of communal Mediterranean meal. We had some falafel and some roasted vegetable, some hummus and pita all in the center of the table. And after some initial hesitation, everyone, without exception, found this meal to be acceptable. So acceptable, in fact, that at one point, unprompted, my daughter turned to me and said, "Daddy, I love this dinner." And then, not to be outdone, my son, between bites of vegetables of all things, said, "Hey, Dad, today at school, we learned about ancient Athens and the birth of direct democracy." Now, that may have been a non sequitur, but he then proceeded to tell me all about what he learned that day without any pleading or cajoling, none of the normal preening that I display in order to get a shred of feedback on educational progress. My daughter even joined back in to tell me about a craft that she made at play school. Rachel and I stopped, looked at each other across the table thinking, what is going on? We decided we're having hummus at dinner from now on. I'm joking a little bit. I think dinners alternate between being one of the most frustrating and enjoyable parts of every parent's day. But what I have learned over time is that when my kids want to share, whatever it is prompted by, I want to be curious in that moment. Now, thankfully, ancient Athens happens to be something I am particularly interested in. I did resist the urge to talk about the New Testament at table. Minecraft, though, is generally somewhat lower on my investment scale. And my daughter's endless parade of scrapes and scratches that need new Band-Aids are endlessly fascinating to her, not so much to me. Still, one of the commitments that I've made to myself is that when my kids are interested, I'm going to try to be. Because what I've learned is that that kind of attention, even for your kids, isn't always automatic. We did a series a few years ago now called Tell Me More. And it was all about trying to be more curious. We used that title, Tell Me More, because as I said in that series, it was a phrase that I had intentionally picked up. I tried to work into my daily vocabulary because I got it from a friend who says it to me all the time. anything I offer in conversation, if he can tell that I'm invested, he will respond, tell me more about that. And I've tried to pick that up, not because I want to drag things out of people or force them to share more than they're interested in volunteering, but because I want to intentionally step outside of my heuristic boundaries. See, as human beings, we are constantly taking in vast amounts of information all the time. And we only have so much attention to go around. In conversations, we are listening for what is said, but we're also listening to what is not said. When we meet someone, we are picking up on all kinds of visual, social cues. Are you leaning in? Are you crossing your arms? Are you checking your phone? Are you locked in with me? We're seeing what's around us, but our brains are actually paying attention to far more than we can consciously be aware of. And so what happens is there are a series of heuristic decisions that are made for us unconsciously. Your brain will discard information you don't need. It might even react emotionally to information you don't perceive. And this isn't necessarily a bug in our programming, it's a feature. See, you and I only have so much computational power available to us. And so over time, in both learned experience and at evolutionary scales, our brains have learned to create a good enough approximation of the world within which then you and I can make our conscious choices. That's what heuristic means. It's a rationalized but not fully perfected model. So a rule of thumb is a heuristic. And a good rule of thumb is you don't need to know what's happening over here, you need to know what's happening here. That's why you got both eyes on the front of your face to focus your attention. However, stereotypes are also heuristics. Preferences are heuristics. In-groups are heuristics. Out-groups are heuristics. And sometimes those heuristics stop us from being as curious as might benefit us in the long term. In fact, I might argue that in the absence of some focused intention, our attention to each other is too limited for our own good. That's why, even with my own son, when he starts talking about ancient Athens at the dinner table, I want to teach myself, discipline myself to pay attention, to respond, tell me more. And this is also where I think Jesus can be a real challenge for us. Because if our intention is this year to pursue more depth and more intimacy in our relationships, knowing that we need more than just our internal monologue to see and perceive the world clearly, then I think Jesus offers some intriguing moments to slow down and pay attention to. And one of them comes in John 5. See, at the start of this chapter, Jesus is heading up to Jerusalem for one of the festivals. And we read that in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, was a specific pool in which the Aramaic called it Bethesda, and it was surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of people with disabilities used to lie, people who were blind or lame or paralyzed. And one who had been there had been paralyzed for 38 years. But when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a very long time, he asked him, "Do you want to be made well?" But the man replied, "Sir, I have no one to help me get into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." And that's kind of a strange response, right? I mean, what on earth is he talking about here? When the water is stirred, someone else goes ahead of me. What is that about? Well, what it's about is a missing verse. I just read verses 1 through 7 in John 5, but if you look this up in your Bible, you'll notice there is no verse 4. Now, it's there. It's probably just down at the bottom of your page in a footnote. This is what it says. It says, "From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the water, and the first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had." And what's happened here is that the story in John depends on this old myth about the pool of Bethesda, a myth that is explained in the missing verse. And presumably the original audience of the gospel would have been well aware of this pool, and the author doesn't bother to explain it for us. He just assumes you will understand from the context of the man's response what he's talking about. Now, it's also possible that the author of this gospel knows this myth is nonsense, that God is not sending angels to stir up races between vulnerable people, and he doesn't want to give it any credence, so he just leaves it as part of this man's superstition. But what happened is, over time, as the gospel propagates and spreads, and there are more and more people reading the passage who have no idea about the Pool of Bethesda, people like us who don't know myths about angels and races to healing waters, somewhere around the 5th century, a scribe decided to add this little bit of context in on the margins. And over time, that marginal note moved in to the text, and eventually it ended up being assigned a verse when the Bible was first divided up into chapters. Now later, as textual criticism realized the mistake, it was relegated back into the margins, or the footnotes, as it were. But the problem was, we had already numbered the verses, and we didn't want to renumber the rest of the chapter, so most Bibles today just skip verse 4. Point is, now we know the full story. The context for this man's objection to Jesus' question. And now we can move on to what is, at least for me, the really interesting part of the story. Verse 6. When Jesus saw him lying there and realized he'd been in this condition for a very long time, he asked, "Do you want to be made well?" And this translation is fine. In fact, it's quite good. I have just one tiny little nitpick. See, the word learned here, as in Jesus learned he had been in this condition, that's the word gnosko in Greek, and it refers to our knowledge. And so most translations that we have today will go with something like this. Jesus, knowing how long this man had been in this condition, asked him, "Do you want to be well?" As my son would say, I'm not a fan of that. To me, that implies that Jesus knows this supernaturally. And that's possible. We do see that kind of thing from time to time throughout the Gospels, but the more straightforward reading of the Greek here is that Jesus comes to know this because he talks with this man. In fact, gnosko here is in the participle form, and if you remember back to grade 6 grammar, that means it's an ing verb, right? So if I was going to translate this, I would go with something like, Jesus, upon learning this man had been in this condition for a very long time, asked him, "Do you want to be made well?" Well, that's a pretty subtle change from the NIV. Like I said, I think the NIV is actually the best that we've got of our contemporary translations, but for me, it's an important change because it helps to clarify the context. This is not Jesus with supernatural knowledge asking rhetorical questions of strangers in vulnerable positions. This is Jesus striking up conversations, asking questions about who he's interacting with, learning about those in front of him, paying attention to who they are and how they want to be treated by him. I don't think this passage is just a set piece for Jesus to perform a miracle. I think this is Jesus genuinely attentive, curious about the people who cross his path. And I'll tell you what, I happen to think that a Jesus who pauses his travel plans, who delays his path to Jerusalem, who starts to talk with a man who's ignored by everyone else and who genuinely wants to know about who this man is, I honestly think that sounds more divine than a Jesus who just knows things because he does. For me, divine doesn't start with the supernatural, it starts with the perfectly loving. And I think that changes some of the calculus in how we imagine, how we understand Jesus' interactions with people. Sometimes we have these questions about prayer, right? Like, why do I need to pray if God already knows everything about me? I mean, what can God possibly learn just because I vocalize my concerns? Well, I'm not suggesting that God doesn't know. I'm simply saying maybe God wants to listen. Maybe God knows there's more to a conversation than simply information. Maybe speaking and listening, self-disclosing and offering our attentive presence to each other. Maybe that is as important, maybe that is more important even than just what is said. In fact, maybe Jesus does know everything about this man, and yet maybe Jesus does want to learn something about him by listening to him. Maybe that's what's divine about the story. Actually, I think about this a lot in terms of the attention that I offer to the people in my life. One of the things I really struggle with is giving attention to more than just information. I spend a lot of my time in any given week writing and crafting language, shaping words and sentences to express my thoughts creatively and succinctly and effectively. And I really enjoy that. I love doing it. Generally, I think I'm pretty good at it as well. But because of that, my perception of myself is often colored by the fact that most of my communication actually has hours of composition and study, editing and refining behind it. I mean, this isn't real life, right? This is me with hours of preparation just to get up and talk for a couple minutes. And maybe because of that, sometimes I have struggled when people aren't able to communicate with the clarity that I expect from myself. Now, let's be honest here. That's a pretty toxic trait in a pastor or a boss, or particularly a parent with kids who are learning how to express themselves. And so I've had to teach myself, I have to work really hard at intentionally slowing down to pay attention, to listen, not just for the information I want out of a conversation. To listen for everything that is being offered to me in every interaction. Now, maybe you would just call that emotional intelligence, but the truth is, some of us, like me, have to work really hard at that. And what I find compelling about Jesus is that I can see the attentiveness that I want in my life modeled in the way that he interacts with the people around him. This is God with soft skills. And that's important to me because it reframes this question that frankly can feel a little bit patronizing here. Now, we're not there for the whole conversation, everything that leads to the question. We don't have all the context that Jesus does, but we do learn a few things along the way. We learn this man has been in this condition for 38 years, implying he's at least somewhat older than that, implying that something happened to him at some point in his story. We learn that he has no one to help him get into the water, implying that over time his community has faded and they've drifted away, implying he has very little social support here in this moment right now. We learn that he has put his trust in perhaps the last shred of hope he has, this myth about angels and magical waters. And this is where I think Jesus' question actually starts to feel personal, responsive to the attentiveness he's offered, not just a rhetorical question. See, this man has said to Jesus that he is focused on getting to the water first. But Jesus asks, do you want to be well? And there's some subtext here, right? Now, this is not the word for healed. It's not the word for fixed or repaired. This is the word for whole and well and healthy. It's about your body, yes, absolutely. But it can just as easily be applied to your social, mental, your economic health as well. This is something a lot closer to the Hebrew idea of shalom. And I have to imagine that Jesus means all of that because that's actually the key to the story for me. Jesus has listened to this man. He's paid attention to this man. He's learned about this man and empathized with the way his options have been narrowed and constricted, constrained by circumstances beyond his control. How he has perhaps had to put his hope in a story that can't possibly save him. And so the answer to Jesus' question isn't obvious, because the question isn't whether he will get to the water first. The question is about giving this man agency over his own story. It's about the option to exit the narrative he's put his trust in and to choose to believe in something different. Something that can actually help. And look, this is going to sound grandiose, but here's the truth. I think we do the same thing for each other every time we truly pay attention to each other's stories. We give each other the option to exit the narrative, however small it is, but that voice somewhere in the back of our head that tells us we are alone, we are on our own, we are uninteresting, and we are unwanted. The attention that you extend, the listening that you receive, it's about more than just the information that's exchanged. It's about reshaping the narrative we carry about who we are and why we matter. And that is very much part of the wellness that I think Jesus invites all of us to discover. To know unequivocally that we matter. That's what the story's about. That's what your conversations can mean. That's what being a little bit more intentional about the attention that you offer can do, not just for the person across from you, but for you as well. It will reshape your narrative about what is important in this world. The thing is, that doesn't always come easily. And it rarely comes without us risking something in our relationships. But that's where we'll pick up next week.